I've always had a fascination with nature, the kind of nature that feels untouched, raw, and infinite. Forests, swamps, mountains, places where the world seems to whisper secrets long forgotten by humanity. So when I heard about a remote forest in Russia, nestled around an ancient swamp, I knew I had to go. The locals called it the Whispering Swamp, though they spoke the name only in hushed tones, as if saying it too loud might summon something. They told me stories of people who ventured too close, only to disappear without a trace. Superstitions, I thought. Every old place has its legends, and I wasn't about to let ghost stories stop me from exploring. The journey was long, hours of hiking through dense woods with a heavy pack on my back. The air was damp, thick with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No distant hum of cars, no chirping of birds, just the crunch of my boots on the forest floor and the occasional rustle of branches overhead. By the time I reached the swamp, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The swamp was beautiful in its own eerie way. Pools of dark water glistened in the fading light, and a thin layer of mist curled around the gnarled roots and reeds. I found a dry patch of ground a few meters from the edge and set up my tent, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. As I sat by my small fire, eating a simple meal, I noticed how still the forest had become. The usual sounds of insects or distant animals were absent, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt oppressive. It was just me, the crackle of the fire, and the faint rustle of the swamp. I told myself it was normal. Remote places often feel strange at first, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. But as the last light of the day faded and darkness wrapped around the swamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric above me, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Outside, the forest seemed to breathe, the faintest of whispers carrying through the misty air. I told myself it was the wind, though deep down, I wasn't so sure. The morning brought a false sense of security. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, painting the swamp in hues of gold and green. The whispers from the previous night felt like a distant memory, the kind of thing you convince yourself was just a bad dream. I packed up my tent and decided to explore further into the swamp. My goal was simple: document the unique flora and fauna, take some photos, and write a blog post about the experience. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I wandered deeper, the terrain became more challenging. The dry patches of ground grew scarcer, forcing me to navigate across slippery roots and patches of ankle-deep water. The air grew heavier, and the sunlight struggled to break through the dense foliage. It was around midday when I first noticed something strange. A tree trunk, thick and ancient, had deep grooves carved into its bark. At first, I thought they were claw marks, perhaps from a bear or some other large animal. But as I examined them closer, they seemed too precise, almost deliberate. They formed a strange pattern, like jagged runes or symbols. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, probably the work of some bored hunter or traveler who had passed through years ago. But as I moved on, I began to see more of them, on trees, on rocks, even etched into the soft mud along the swamp's edge. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The silence was back, thicker than before. Even the sound of my own footsteps felt muffled, like the forest was swallowing every noise I made. That's when I heard it, a faint splash, like something moving through the water behind me. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, I turned, scanning the swamp for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the stillness of the water and the eerie shapes of twisted roots and plants. Probably an animal, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded weak, even to my own ears. But then it happened again, a splash, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source. Still nothing. The swamp seemed empty, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to keep moving, picking up my pace. The trail I was following grew fainter, barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. My boots sank deeper into the mud with each step, and the dense mist made it harder to see more than a few meters ahead. Then I saw it, A figure tall, looming, partially obscured by the mist. It stood motionless among the trees, its silhouette blending with the swamp's shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't look human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. Its body seemed to blend with the environment, like it was covered in mud, plants, and moss. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for the figure. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. I couldn't shake the image of the figure. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn back and get out of the swamp while I still could. But my pride, or perhaps my curiosity, kept me moving forward. I told myself I had come too far to retreat. As I pressed on, the environment grew more hostile. The mud clung to my boots like quicksand, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The mist had deepened, and the sunlight was now barely visible through the dense canopy above. The symbols I had seen earlier began to appear more frequently. They were carved not just into the trees, but into strange wooden totems that jutted out of the swamp. These totems were crude, their shapes resembling humanoid figures with elongated limbs and twisted faces. Some of them had what looked like bones tied to them with frayed vines. I felt a deep unease as I passed them, like I was walking through a graveyard. The air was heavy with an unspoken threat, and I found myself whispering a silent apology as I moved past each one. Then the trail disappeared completely. One moment, I was following a faint path. The next, I was surrounded by nothing but endless swamp. The landmarks I had been using to navigate were gone, swallowed by the mist. Panic set in. I pulled out my map and compass, but they were useless. The map didn't account for the maze-like twists and turns of the swamp, and the compass needle spun erratically, refusing to settle on a direction. "Great," I muttered, my voice trembling. "Just great." I decided to retrace my steps, but every turn looked the same. The trees and totems blurred together, creating an oppressive sense of déjà vu. It was as if the swamp itself was alive, shifting and changing to keep me trapped. And then I heard it again, the splashing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, but it grew louder, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was following me. I spun around, my eyes scanning the murky water. That's when I saw the footprints. They were pressed deep into the mud, larger than any human foot should be, with long, claw-like impressions at the toes. They were fresh, leading from the water's edge to where I was standing. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the prints didn't belong to any animal I had ever seen. And worse, they were heading in the same direction I had been walking. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I had to stay calm, had to think rationally. But the splashing grew louder, closer. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen was blank except for a no-service message. And then, just ahead of me, I saw it again. The figure. This time, it was closer, more defined. Its body was grotesque, covered in layers of mud, moss, and tangled roots. Its limbs were impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was obscured by vines, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard, the impact knocking the air out of my lungs. When I looked up, the figure was gone, but the splashing hadn't stopped. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, echoing through the swamp. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The world around me became a blur of trees and mist as I pushed through the swamp, my breath ragged and my legs burning. But no matter how far I ran, the splashing followed. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, the thick swamp air burning my throat. My legs trembled with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The splashing, heavy and deliberate, was right behind me. It didn't matter how fast or far I went. It was always there, as if it was toying with me, letting me believe I could escape. Suddenly, I broke into a clearing. The swamp seemed to fall silent, and for a brief moment, I thought I had outpaced whatever was following me. The mist was thinner here, revealing a large, stagnant pool of water at the center of the clearing. The air smelled sour, like decay, and the eerie silence was broken only by the occasional ripple on the water's surface. But something was wrong. The clearing didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a trap. I turned slowly, scanning the edge of the clearing. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches clawing at the gray sky. My instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by the oppressive stillness. And then I saw it. The figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the clearing with deliberate, almost ceremonial movements. Now, there was no mist obscuring it. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with long, gnarled limbs covered in layers of mud and moss. Vines wrapped around its torso like armor, and its arms ended in claw-like hands. Its head was an amalgamation of swamp debris and skeletal features, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. But the worst part was the sound. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest, vibrating through the air. It wasn't animalistic. It was something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat tightened, and my knees buckled. The creature tilted its head as if studying me, and for a moment, I thought it might leave me alone. But then it took a step forward, and I felt an overwhelming wave of dizziness. The world around me began to blur. My vision dimmed, and my ears were filled with a deafening static. It was like my senses were being stripped away. One by one, I stumbled backward, clutching at my head, trying to fight the disorientation. No, this isn't real," I muttered, my voice weak and slurred. But it was real. The creature took another step, and with each movement, the sensations grew worse. I could barely see now, just shadows and shapes moving in the mist. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the ground. As I lay there, helpless, I felt something cold and wet wrap around my ankle. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't mud. It was one of the creature's vine-like appendages. It began to drag me toward the stagnant pool, the murky water rippling as if it were alive. "No!" I screamed, finding my voice at last. I clawed at the ground, trying to anchor myself, but the mud gave way beneath my fingers. The creature loomed over me, its hollow sockets staring into my soul. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something within them, memories, faces, fragments of lives it had taken before me. And then, just as I was about to be pulled into the water, a deafening crack echoed through the clearing. The creature recoiled, its grip loosening. I scrambled backward, my heart racing as I searched for the source of the sound. In the distance, through the mist, I saw the faint glow of a lantern. The light of the lantern swayed through the mist like a beacon in the dark, accompanied by hurried footsteps. My body ached, but I pushed myself up, dragging myself away from the stagnant pool and the creature that still loomed by its edge. It hesitated, its hollow sockets shifting toward the source of the light. For a moment, it seemed unsure, almost wary. The guttural growl that had filled the clearing was replaced by a low, clicking noise, as if it were trying to communicate or warn me. Then, from the fog, a figure emerged, a man older, with a grizzled beard and weathered skin that spoke of years spent battling the elements. He wore a heavy coat, boots caked in mud, and carried an old, oil-lit lantern in one hand. In the other, he gripped a shotgun, its barrel gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Get away from there," he shouted, his voice rough but commanding. The creature let out a shriek, an inhuman wail that made my ears ring. It retreated slightly, its massive frame blending back into the shadows of the trees. I couldn't tell if it was leaving or simply watching, waiting. The man grabbed my arm and hoisted me to my feet with surprising strength. "You shouldn't be here," he said gruffly, his eyes scanning the trees. What is that thing?" I stammered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled me along, his grip firm and unyielding. You're lucky I found you. Most don't get that chance. We moved quickly through the swamp, the lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the ground. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the creature to lunge out of the darkness and drag me back. But it didn't. The oppressive weight of its presence lingered, though, like an unshakable shadow. The man's cabin appeared through the mist, a small, ramshackle structure built on stilts to keep it above the swamp's waterline. It looked ancient, the wood dark and weathered, but it radiated a strange sense of safety. Once inside, he bolted the door and placed the lantern on a rickety table. The room was cluttered with hunting gear, maps, and jars filled with murky liquid. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting a dim orange glow. "Sit," he ordered, motioning to a worn chair by the fire. I sank into it, my legs too weak to stand any longer. My mind raced with questions, but I couldn't form the words. The man poured a dark liquid from a flask into a chipped mug and handed it to me. "Drink. It'll help." I took a hesitant sip, the bitter taste burning my throat but warming my insides. "What was that thing out there?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He sat across from me, his expression grim. "That's Antsybal," he said. "Or at least, that's what the old stories call it." "Stories?" He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "This swamp's been cursed for generations. They say Antsybal is a guardian of sorts, but not in a way that protects people. It guards the swamp itself, punishing anyone who dares to intrude too far." "But why? What does it want?" He shrugged, the lines on his face deepening. "It doesn't want anything. It just is. You cross its path. You pay the price." I shuddered, remembering the way it had toyed with me, stripping away my senses. It felt like it was in my head, like it was taking something from me. The man's eyes darkened. "That's how it works. It doesn't kill you right away. It takes your mind first, then your soul." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling fire. "Why did you help me?" I asked. His gaze softened, though his expression remained somber. "Because someone helped me once, a long time ago, and I couldn't save them. Maybe saving you is my way of making up for that." I wanted to ask more, to understand the full story, but the exhaustion overtook me. My eyelids grew heavy, and before I knew it, I was drifting into a restless sleep. When I woke, the fire had burned down to embers, and the man was gone. The cabin felt colder, emptier, as if his presence had been the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. On the table, where the lantern had been, there was now a map. A red circle marked a spot deep within the swamp, with a note scrawled beside it. "Stay away." But I knew I wouldn't. Something about Antsybal, about this swamp, had taken hold of me, and I couldn't let it go.